This is one of the series of postgraduate dissertation or research project checklist. This is the third checklist on methodology chapter, and I am Dr. Xiangping Susie Du. The concept of methodology might sound unfamiliar to many students. So the concept of methodology is normally used in conjunction with the concept of methods. So what do they mean? So methodology and methods are referring to how the research was conducted and why the research was conducted in that way. So to start with methods, which might be easier to understand. Methods refers to the specific tools and techniques that the researcher has applied to conduct the research. So for example, to collect the data and to analyze the data. So as it entails, it normally includes data collection methods and data analysis methods, explaining how the researcher have collected the data and analyzed the data. So methodology refers to the theories or concepts underlying the choice of the specific methods. So a lot of students refer to the academic reference book Saunders Business Research for Students to understand the concept of methodology and methods. So the Research Onion is a very commonly used framework for students to construct their methodology and methods chapter. So what does a methodology look like in a postgraduate dissertation or research project? So methodology is normally the third chapter of a dissertation or research project. It normally starts with an introduction and ends with a summary, like any other chapters. So the main body for the methodology composes of methodology, the theories underpinning the research, and then the specific methods for data collection and data analysis. So therefore, 3.1 to start with introduction, and 3.2 you may explain the specific methodologies applied in the research. If you refer to Saunders Onion ring, you may refer to the philosophy, approach, and strategy. And then followed by the data collection methods in 3.3. So when you are collecting the data, it depends whether your research is primary research or secondary research. If it's primary research, you may refer to the methods, the tools and techniques that you used to collect the data. For example, it could be surveys or interviews. Yeah, you have to talk about, so who are the persons who took part in your research and the participants of your research, which refers to the sampling of the research methods, and then the ethics related to the research when you are conducting the primary research. So if your research is secondary research, so you may have to explain whether your research is a case study or the specific secondary sources for the research data. And then next, in 3.4, you may need to explain specific data analysis methods and the tools, techniques that you used to analyze the data. So when it comes to the data analysis methods, it depends whether the data you collected is quantitative or qualitative. If it's quantitative, you may explain how you analyze that. For example, you may have used statistical analysis tools, Excel or SPSS. If your data is qualitative, you may have to explain to the reader how you analyze the data. For example, you may use thematic analysis, discourse analysis, and you may have used NVivo software or just analyze them manually. And then you finish with 3.5 as a summary section. So this chapter normally takes 15 or 20% of the word count. By reading through this chapter, your reader should clearly understand how you conducted the research and why you conducted the research in that way. Now let's look at the marking criteria and mark sheet that is used to assess the methodology chapter. So the handbook states, for outstanding research methods and methodology, students need to demonstrate an outstanding understanding of methodology and methods, evidences an outstanding ability to critically evaluate many existing methodologies and suggest many new alternative approaches to current research and or professional practice. Employs a highly suitable, critically considered and evaluated methodology, which is completely understood, well explained, and thoroughly justified, having critically considered alternative methodologies. Uses excellent data collection methods which enable the collection of excellent quality data that is valid, reliable, and perhaps extensive. So the mark sheet, as highlighted in red, states two sections, methodology and methods of data collection. So it hasn't included the data analysis methods or methods of data collection because it has been covered in the next mark sheet on analysis and findings as shown below. But let's interpret what the methodology look for. So as it says, it requires you to demonstrate your complete understanding, clear explanation, critical evaluation, thorough justification, and consideration of alternative methodologies and methods, and suggestion of new approaches if possible. So the marking criteria contains a lot of information that might be difficult for you to understand and to unpack. But let's unpack the marking criteria by looking into the checklist and then section by section according to the rough structure that we explained earlier. So firstly, let's look into the checklist of the introduction section. So you have to check in the methodology chapter whether you have included an introduction section. And if you have included it, have you recapped the main research question or the main aim or purpose of the research? So it's important for you to state what this research is about before you informing your reader how you're going to conduct the research. And then have you stated any research hypotheses that you want to test or any specific research question or objectives that related to the execution of the research at the beginning of the chapter? And have you explained how this chapter will support you to answer the relevant research question or achieve the research objectives? For example, you may mention this research is going to adopt qualitative research in order to understand the correlation between A and B. Yeah? And have you signposted the structure of this chapter? For example, you say you would explain the data collection methods first and then informing the reader how the data was analyzed later. Moving on from introduction, you come to methodology section. So in the methodology section, you must bear in mind of the marking criteria about your understanding and then your evaluation and your justification. So you have to check in this section whether you have described what methodological concepts or frameworks that are relevant to your research. So for example, you may see according to Saunders et al. 2015, there are few research choices available for this research. For example, mono-qualitative and mono-quantitative, mixed method and multiple methods. Yeah, so you're describing, showing your understanding that you know there are many different methodological concepts available or relevant to your research. And then you have to explain what you mean by these concepts. And then you refer to them saying quantitative research refers to and normally applies for what kind of research. And by contrast, and qualitative research refers to something. And here you would have to use references because you're using concepts from existing scholars and researchers. Yeah. And after having described and explained to show your understanding of the theoretical concepts that are relevant to your research, and then you have to evaluate them. So look into the pros and cons, evaluate the relevance to your research, and also indicating the practical and technical aspects of these methodological frameworks, concepts, and then justify their relevance. And the links to whether you have justified your choice by referring to the specific research question you're going to achieve. Yeah, because the purpose of evaluation is to see their pros and cons for all of them, but this research adopts this particular one or combination of one, two, is because of what? Because it is relevant to this particular research and this topic area, yeah, or relevant to this particular research question or to achieve the research objective. So it's very important that you demonstrate according to the marking criteria your understanding, your explanation, and your evaluation and justification of the choice. And obviously here in this section, you must show that you refer to the reliable and credible source before you make your final justification and choice. Next is data collection methods. So data collection methods differs depending whether your research is primary research or secondary research. So in checklist 3, we are referring to primary research. So in a similar way as you explain and justify the methodology, in the data collection methods, you have to explain and describe what are the primary research data collection methods available based on the nature of your research. For example, if your research is qualitative, you may adopt the methods such as semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, observations for your data collection. If your research is quantitative, you may use surveys or experiments to collect your primary data. So, therefore, you must clearly state your understanding of all these tools and techniques that is applicable or relevant to your research, and then evaluate them by referring to their pros and cons, and then justify which one you have used, and also referring to practical and technical aspects. So this is where the marking criteria refers. You have to justify your choice by considering the alternative options. Yeah, so this is very similar to methodology approach. You show your understanding and explain what are available, and then evaluate them before you state clearly which particular method or tool that you have adopted for your research. And then the most important thing for primary research is where your research is collecting primary hand data, is to say later how you have applied this particular method to collect the data. For example, you may have used semi-structured interviews or online surveys for different kind of research. Yeah, so how did you do that? So for example, you may say you organize the interviews using Zoom meeting software, or you designed the online survey using online survey tool and send the link on social media and platforms. So you have to clearly explain how you have applied this method. Yeah. So next, followed by primary research is, so you use this method and to whom? Yeah. So who are the participants involved in research? Yeah. So, and how you recruit them? How did you invite them to take part in your research? Okay. And then, and how many, for example, you recruited and you invited for your research. So that relates to the very important section. You discuss the participants for your research and you justify the sampling methods. So obviously your research would not recruit anybody. So these participants must be relevant to your research. For example, consumers of a particular brand, yeah, or residents of a particular area. All right, and how many of them? Yeah, so this is the sampling methods you have to justify. So in relation to that is the ethics application. So you can't just approach the people, the participants, without applying for ethics. That's very important. You check that whether you have applied for ethics approval. So you cannot conduct any primary research before you have obtained this ethics approval from the ethics committee. So your supervisor will be able to guide you about the ethics application process. So for any primary research, ethics application must be obtained at the very beginning of your research, okay? And then it's important that you got the ethics approval, and in the process of collecting the first-hand primary data, you adhere to this ethical guidance you have mentioned in your ethics application. So for example, you say you are using online surveys to collect the data, so you must use online survey. You can't change it to interviews if you haven't mentioned interviews in your ethics application, okay? Or you haven't been granted interviews for your research. So it's very important that you stick to the ethics guidance. And also it's important in this process, you need to bear in mind of the limitations which you may need to acknowledge at the very end of the section. So primary research is where the researcher is collecting first-hand data from its samples or participants to get the most updated and first-hand data for its own research purpose. So not every single research is suitable for primary research, or sometimes not practical to collect first-hand data. So in which case, the researcher may just adopt secondary data, so which refers to a secondary research only. So if your research is secondary research only, so the checklist is very similar in the first few points. So whether you have described what the secondary research data collection methods available to your research, for example, whether your research is case study and the data is already available for this particular company under public domain, that you just need to use that to as your data and analyze later, yeah? Or whether it's archive research, whether there's already trails of data or information available for you to work on for the research, yeah? And have you explained the relevant data collection methods or sources, specifically whatever databases or empirical data collected by other people or archives or companies' internal data, for example, could be the companies in the meeting minutes over the past few years, and that you can use to analyze it. And it's important also, you need to check whether they have evaluated and justified your choice of the data sources, and then to ensure the credibility and relevance of them to your research. And also, you need to mention the in-text citations, mention the relevant sources. If it's a database, what database, and then what is the source, and then to verify the credibility, reliability again. Yeah, and also those secondary research and the data is not collected by yourself, you still need to check whether there's any ethical related issues you need to be aware. For example, you need to say explain whether the data is already available in the public domain and for the public to access without having to ask permission, or you would need to get the author's permission to have access to the data. For example, if a researcher published his research data for the company is a private confidential report, and you have to ask permission to use that. And similarly, is the company's meeting minutes, as we said, or board report, which are regarded as confidential, private to the company itself, in which case you would still need to ask permission from the company before you can use it, although you could be part-time working there, but you still need to get permission to use it. Okay, and also you have to check whether they have acknowledged any potential limitations in this data collection process of the secondary data. So for example, you may say the data is only available for 5 years, and then you can't say a historical or trail of data. Okay. After having explained, evaluated, and justified the methods that you have used to collect the data, now it comes to the point that you have to explain how you analyze the data, so which refers to the data analysis methods. So when it comes to data analysis, it depends whether your data is quantitative or qualitative. That means whether the data sets you have are mainly about words or about numbers. So for example, if you're looking into financial reports to analyze the performance of a company financially, so you would be mainly dealing with numbers, that is quantitative research. But if you're understanding why and how by speaking to for example, the employees or managers, so where the transcripts of your conversation would be mainly about words, that is qualitative. Yeah. So if your research or if your data is quantitative, so the data analysis methods, you need to check the following things. So again, you need to check in a similar way, bearing in mind of the marking criteria about your understanding, explanation, evaluation, justification. So you need to see whether you have described the available data analysis methods for your quantitative data. So for example, you may explain the available methods or tools like Excel or SPSS, and you would use the functionality of descriptive analysis, correlation, regression, or t-tests. So you describe the available ones and then explain what they are by referring to relevant sources, which refers to the in-text citations, and evaluate them, look into the pros and cons and the practicality and technical constraints of all of them, and then justify which one or ones you have chosen that is suitable to the purpose of your research. Yeah. So again, it's the whole process to show you not only understood what they are, but also evaluated them and justified you choose this one for your research, which is the most suitable to your research. And in the data analysis section, you still need to bear in mind of the ethics that you agreed and that you applied from the ethics committee. So you have to conform to the ethics that you have already stated in the ethics application, yeah, and what you have been granted. So for example, the anonymity, the privacy, confidentiality, so you should conform to that. For example, you will not disclose the specific participant's name in the process of your analysis or in your transcript. And also you have to see whether you have cross-referenced the relevant data source to the appendices. So for example, you may say interview 1, and then whether you have referred to the interview 1 in your appendices, yeah, in the text and then in the final appendices. And also you need to say whether there's any limitations in the data analysis process that you need to acknowledge as well. Similarly, if your data is qualitative, and in the data analysis method section, you have to check whether you have described the available qualitative data analysis methods, for example, thematic analysis, content analysis, or using constant comparative approach, using NVivo software. So whether you have presented and showed the understanding of all these available methods to analyze your qualitative data. Yeah, you have to explain what they are by using in-text citations. And then you have to evaluate them again, look into the pros and cons and practical and technical side of them, and then before you justify that your final choice of the specific data analysis method for your qualitative data. So in these sections where you must check whether you have applied reliable, credible source to justify your choice of the specific method. Yeah, and again, you have to see whether you have complied to the ethics that you have been granted, and then you conform to what you agreed in terms of the anonymity, privacy, confidentiality, and so on. And again, if you have cross-referenced to any data sources, for example, interview transcripts, which is available in the appendices, and then you must cross-reference it in the text, and then make sure they're consistent, and then with the right numbers, for example, Appendix 1, Appendix 2, okay? And also you have to check whether there's any limitations in this qualitative data analysis process that you need to acknowledge. If yes, you must state it. For example, you may say this qualitative data, the interview transcripts, were analyzed manually. So therefore, manual analysis might have some limitations. So that's something you have to mention about it. Coming next is the summary section. So therefore, you have to check whether you have included the summary section in this chapter in response to the introduction section in this chapter. So where you justify you have applied the most appropriate methodologies and methods to conduct the research and so to achieve your research aim and objectives. And also you have to check whether it is necessary for you to include limitations in this chapter. But obviously, research limitations can also be placed in the conclusion chapter. But some students may decide to put the limitations in this chapter, in which case it is okay. But however, despite the limitations, you must justify the reliability and validity of your research, where you have to clearly state that you, as the researcher, have done your best to ensure the credibility and reliability of the research. Finally, in this methodology chapter, you must check whether the structure has been applied appropriately. So for example, first, you have to check whether you used appropriate headings and subheadings in this chapter. And they are numbered, including introduction, summary, methodologies, data collection methods, and data analysis methods. And have you applied accurate tense in this chapter? So tenses in this chapter can be very complicated and can be very different at places. So for example, you must use present tense when you describe and explain some theoretical concepts. So for example, when you refer to, according to Saunders, research philosophy refers to, where you must use present tense because the concepts still stands. Yeah. So but when you explain how the research was conducted, you must use past tense because it had already happened by the time you're writing this chapter. So for example, if your research is qualitative and 5 interviews were conducted via Zoom, so you must say were conducted, or 5 people took part in the interview, so where you use past tense. Yeah. So if your research is quantitative, and you may say online surveys were posted on social media platform and 80 surveys were collected, so where you must use past tense. And have you avoided using any personal phrases in this chapter by using the researcher instead of I to replace you as the researcher, okay? And using passive tenses when necessary. So instead of saying, I conducted the interview, you may say interviews were conducted, okay? So instead of using I, you're using passive tense, okay? So where you feel necessary to put I and the subject at the beginning, you can use the researcher to replace it, okay? So the researcher conducted this, okay? And then you have to check, have you accurately and consistently included figures and tables when necessary? So for example, if you need to include Saunders Research Onion to construct this chapter, and you may have to include this research onion in this chapter. So if you include the figure in this chapter, so you must put numbered headings, say figure 1, research onion, and then you must put the references there. You must say Saunders et al. 2015 : and that specific page number where you got this figure from. Yeah, because it's very unlikely you would draw the figure yourself. Since normally you copy paste this figure and put it there, so you have to use it as direct quotations, and you must put the page number when you include the in-text citations. Okay. And then you have to check whether you have appropriately used appendices or appendix in this chapter. So especially when you refer to the data, how the data was conducted or collected or consist of. So for example, is a copy of the questionnaire or the interview questions, or if it's secondary data, for example, financial report of a company, it's very unlikely you would need to put them in the main body because of the length of it. So it's very necessary for you to put them in the appendices. So you have numbered appendix headings and consistently, accurately applied. And Appendix 1, Appendix 2, Appendix 3. Alright? And again, like the figures or tables, so for appendices, you must cross-reference them in the main body as well. So when you explain, saying 5 interviews were conducted, and then you put in bracket, see Appendix 2, for example, interview questions. Yeah, so it's very important in this chapter you make sure the structure is correct. As you may have sensed, methodology chapter can be challenging. Therefore, you must utilize all the possible support available to you. Discuss it with your supervisor if you're unclear, whether your research should be primary or secondary, or whether you should collect quantitative or qualitative data. And use your module leader to direct you to the right resources or support. And the module site always have a lot of useful resources for you to refer to, for example, statistics support and information on other relevant support. And the case resources, as we mentioned, as we would mention every time, so case, dissertations, project section, numeracy statistics would all be relevant to you writing up this chapter. As we mentioned earlier, the case resources is a must and essential source that you must utilize, and there are quite a number of guide and recordings on methodology chapter on qualitative research or secondary research, so you must use that. And besides the case resources, and there are some general references or reading list on research methodology or conducting a major research project or doing dissertations. So I'm listing a few just for your reference. There are some more reading lists or references available on the postgraduate dissertation handbook, so please feel free to utilize it as well. I hope this presentation helps you to construct your methodology chapter. If you have any doubts or questions regarding what I've presented earlier, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm Dr. Xiangping Susi Du. Thank you.